I'm drawn between making two very different recordings, although they could have some overlap, perhaps or some convergence. I'm on the precipice of writing a book, or starting to write my book, even though my research isn't completely finished, but it's very close enough that the act of writing a book will probably help me synthesize the final sort of chapters. Anyway, yeah, so I actually wanted to make a recording, perhaps giving it an outline of how to structure that book, which is really quite a strange thing to upload to YouTube. But anyway, uh, and I have hit on a subject recently which I wasn't looking at Rebel Wisdom, but over the past 10 days or so, I even uploaded a video called something about the cultural wasteland, and why art and entertainment and media in general um, can't has kind of lost its cohesion. It's lost its cogency because it's lost its context. We have kind of the thing that made the West great, or the thing that made I'm going to say, or in some sense, the spirit of British liberalism. Uh, which was a kind of cultural technology in some sense, um, which I think is quite a spiritual sort of culture in some sense, because it is about the individual, and therefore it is about the soul, because it really does sort of take the individual and place it above all the other models and sort of cultural structures that one has. It really does shine a light onto that as being a pivotal point at which the rest of society, or the rest of whatever is going on, is somewhat in the background, even though it might present itself as being, sort of an important point of confrontation, and there might be certain issues which sort of in the perennial mix, sort of present themselves as real obstacles, but it's sort of the actual narrative of the culture is centered around the individual, and that framework has sort of been tilted off of its axis, and as that axis has dissolved and disintegrated, um, we've really lost something very precious. And I explained how this is why writing is so bad, and how we cannot connect to media, which is trying to broadcast this ideological agenda that centers its moral consideration in identity, and so that there is no longer a universal metric of humanism that is this kind of shared theme that that universalizes the fourth wall, the audience, with the plot. Because if you have that meta commentary on that universal moral schema, which is being, let's say, thematically developed by the plot, so that you can see something about your soul, you can see something timeless and eternal, so that there is something that is being delivered to you, being delivered to the audience, which is essentially a theme that has a universal quality to it, a universal morality, because that universal morality has now been has lost its cultural hegemony, and we've moved into this kind of identitarian epistemic pluralism, and this, you can call it a kind of some kind of epistemology that is rooted in social constructivism, and therefore the only thing, so things are now, the message is not delivered to you as a generic audience, as a universal witness, but you are being beseeched as a category of lived experience. And that is very denigrating, that is very demeaning. it's fundamentally racialized, but also everything else. It's fundamentally bigoted. And as we are supposed to consume this new moral wavelength, or this new moral language, and this new contemplative, sort of space of being, we have been subjugated down many pegs into a corrupted culture in some sense, and we've lost that. We've now lost this kind of cultural sensibility, um, and that really is a lot to lose. And now we are living in the wasteland of what we have lost, and many people haven't, I think, cottoned onto this too deeply. So yeah, what is this video called? Narrative collapse. So I've only watched 5 minutes of this video of narrative collapse. And I skimmed through the comments, and I see that they spoke about Jordan Peterson quite a bit, and essentially how he was perhaps the only thing that was actively trying to supplement the loss of something, or the threat of something, with real structure, or something like that. So I mean, I can guess maybe the content of the rest of this. So I think I'm just going to talk about this, because I think there are lots of problems. How do I want to put this? First of all, Rebel Wisdom says things, they use terms, they use phrases, which I think are poisonous phrases. I think they are problematic. Let me just get into the substance rather. Like, it's not as if they are meaningless phrases. They could have some significance, but they have to be contextualized in a highly fine-tuned way, and they are essentially unimportant. They're part of something else in some sense. But yeah, so if you want to talk about collective sense making, or something like that, or I can't remember what the collective intelligence, or some other shit like that. This is antithetical to individual normative morality and understanding. This really takes you out of yourself. This puts you in some kind of perennial circus, that you're, that you're part of some collective vehicle or something like that. So you can essentially shirk the burden of sort of epistemic responsibility off your shoulders, and you can just kind of attach yourself to some sort of cult, or something like that, or see yourself as properly situated. This is I would say, a crutch and a supplementation of actual self-actualization or development. So I find that it's not the only reason why it's poisonous and problematic, but that's roughly kind of what the problem is with talking about collective sense making or collective intelligence. Now, it is true in practice that, I mean, you could say, oh, well, I'm doing some kind of collective intelligence or sense making because now I'm riffing off of the title of this video, and I'm responding to it. So it's like, well, maybe I'm in the mix of a general communication, that someone might see this recording. Even if they don't listen to it, they might see the title of it in the corner of their eye, and that'll influence them unconsciously, and they'll make a comment, and somebody else will read the comments, and so maybe there's a collective process that's going on there. Yeah, I mean, I don't I don't want to comment too much about that, because that's very close to magical thinking. That's, I mean, yes, there is, there's, let's say, some kind of mimetic pool that you have some proximity to, and maybe you can call that collective intelligence or collective sense making. Watch yourself. This is, you're trying to make a mountain out of a molehill. It is true that we can sort of touch base with something that But I mean, who gave significance to a comment to read it? Who chose to discern, if an idea is worthy of being repurposed? It's the internal locus of control. It's the internal understanding. And to the extent to which that people are going to run on autopilot and they're going to be sort of mindless peons that are just going to be part of some collective that they've decided to associate themselves with, that then you can call them, oh, well, they're useful filters and projectors and broadcasters to keep some important memes alive. Well, then you've already reduced people into a disgusting form of sort of mimetic atomism. It's almost akin to nihilism, and it's antithetical to the real gold of understanding and such. So I think that whole phrase collective sense making and collective intelligence, please, is garbage. Or at least please don't talk about it, because it's like saying, please, Mr. External Locus of Control, lift me up and take me to a better world, sort of take me to Zion, take me to the rapture, or something like that. I mean, it's almost a pseudo-religious sort of afterlife. Well, we can't achieve anything on the earth, but the collective will do it for me somehow. Anyway, let me not harken on about this. Yeah, so in that vein, I would just like to say what we are suffering from is the loss of a moral, cultural consensus that we used to have, that was at least which was a very, let's say, hopeful beacon of a kind of a I mean, it was a good way marker that sort of entrenched. I mean, we mustn't be too overly sentimental about these things. I mean, in some sense, I think it could even be seen as a positive that the average in culture has now become, let's just say, a kind of a doom spiral or a vortex or a black hole. Because now, if you actually care about having a kind of, if you actually care about having a workable culture, a functioning culture, a stabilizing and vital and robust culture, now you actually have to be a contrarian in order to do that. You can't just say, well, society agrees with me. In fact, you have to say society is actually, sort of in zombie mode right now. Society is kind of, I mean, I have, I have a theory about this, which many people might call a conspiracy. I don't believe that I need to prove that what I'm saying is true or not, because I think it works good enough as a metaphor for what's going on. It doesn't have to be true. It just has to kind of culturally. I need to neaten up that thought, perhaps, but let me just describe it. So I think effectively what's happening is we are moving into. There are too many complicated facets like this, and I do explore this in my recordings, but I'm just going to elaborate. I guess an overview and not go into substantiating and justifying these sorts of claims. But essentially, what has happened is we have sacrificed normative morality. We've sacrificed saying that society should be governed by a kind of meritocracy, that we should have a kind of everything should be above board. We should have objective criteria that we follow. We should have a kind of everyone should have to conform to the same standard of the same standard should be applied to everyone across the board, and that the best person should win the race, or should get the job, or should be picked, or something like that, based on sort of objective criteria. Now, as soon as you kind of have identity politics, or you have anything like that, you create this kind of this ability to virtue signal. You can do things because the ends justify the means, and then essentially the signal in the institution or in the system at large becomes essentially it effectively becomes a distortion to the meritocracy. It becomes a distortion to normative morality. But that distortion on that metric is a virtue signal. And so you get a competing paradigm that essentially the virtue signal and the narrative that the virtue signal is a part of becomes an alternative schema. It becomes an alternative reality even. And that is now what we are sort of crowded with. And if you don't refute that cultural hegemon, or I mean on a personal level, if you don't opt out of it, if you don't unplug yourself from it actively, and it does require effort to do that, because people want almost, it's a little bit of a weakness within people. I would go into detail with this because I have extensive expertise with understanding personality through my own theories, which I need to write a book about. But anyway, there will be a general tendency in order to kind of harmonize one's moral landscape with, into some kind of alignment that is generally shared by what you conceive of as being the societal standard, or some kind of, or the, or at least the your sense of your peers or something like that. You're going to want to homogenize with some group or something like that. And so there is a tremendous tendency in order to sort of slump into some kind of lowest common denominator in that way, especially, and to a large extent, I mean, it has to do also with harmonizing with whatever narrative is being broadcast, because I mean, and this is just like an energy outlay thing, because if you have to disagree or question every message, I mean, literally, I mean, this is a proven fact in psychology that, like, it's a tremendous amount. If anything that someone tells you, you have like a 90% chance of believing it. Like it doesn't matter about what you might think about it, or it's literally, when people are told something, they just believe it. It's called, I think it's called the Bayes rate fallacy, or the, yeah, it's called something. I think it's called the Bayes rate fallacy. It's crazy, but it's just that people just replicate whatever is spoken to them. They have a huge automatic sort of absorption of it. It's crazy. It's not 100%, but it's surprisingly above 90%. It's crazy. And so it requires a lot of energy to negate. It requires to filter, to actively filter and consciously filter. And so, it takes less energy to just fall into the appearances of consensus. And that's why I think also there's a lot of energy towards trying to ostensibly create, or rather to create the ostensible, man, I'm repeating myself, to create the appearance of consensus. So it's all about framing, and this is why journalism, I think, has kind of been completely twisted and contrived to perform this new kind of societal, it's weird. It's almost as if the elites or the plutocracy that controlled society said, well, kind of liberalism is actually too difficult to keep the to keep up this ideology is just it's too onerous on us. It would be much better if we kind of novated it, if we just kind of contorted it into a new kind of moral paradigm. So and all we need to do is kind of produce a consensus engine and produce a narrative that is uh, you know that is very harsh against people who don't conform, which is why I would say right now it's very important that independent bastions of sense making um, start gaining ground, and in some sense, in some sense, it's almost a political thing to, like, where you get your news from has become a political thing, and there's no, let's say, readily available institution that people can sort of trust, which isn't in some sense a kind of political partisan machine. Um, and I would say that this is because institutional integrity has has been warped by essentially undermining and destabilizing normative values. That essentially it's the virtue signaling, let's say, pseudo intellectual economy that has clouded out and displaced all the voices of it's weird that every usually in journalists you get different types of journalists, you get different types of personalities, you get different types of people within every organization and institution, and you get a certain temperament of people who are not they have the lower voice, in some sense they have they're not cheerleaders. They're not in the front lines. They kind of comment on things, like a week before it's breaking. Sorry, a week after it's breaking news. They're not. They give the kind of the thorough digestion of the issue, and they contextualize it, within some kind of deeper, broader, more substantive, sort of considered thing. You almost see this within COVID-19, how um, hysterical many of the voices are that are sort of part of this moral panic, and then essentially everyone who kind of falls foul of the mainstream media narrative, they get sort of chucked in a loony bin. And so we kind of are systematically finding people who are independent critical thinkers, and we are removing them and from, let's say, the mainstream institutional things. And so what we get left with is a kind of is a very pliable, all the people that are pliable to whatever narrative is going to be broadcast at them. um, so I think that what is under threat is, let's say, independent sense making. And this is also why I'm very critical of these notions, which I do find disgusting, like collective intelligence and collective sense making. That's like, you can talk about that as an activity and then explain what you mean when you want to refer to it as an activity, but it's not some magic that's going to save you. Uh, you know. So yeah, Anyways, that's my point about that. You can maybe say, oh yeah, there's a lot of collective sense making, or there's a lot of collective intelligence that's going on. And well, what are you saying? You're just saying, oh yeah, well, we think our group, our organization, or our culture is very hot right now. Like, and what the fuck does that even mean? It's vague. It's I don't know. It's either a vague concept or it's a poisonous one, and I don't, like, why are you even using it? It's almost like you're just trying to puff up some claim or something like that. But it's a bit of nonsense, I would say, or it's also dangerous as well, because it derogates from what the actual project needs to be. It derogates what the actual cultivation of substance needs to be, and it is almost leaning into what I would say is flagrant magical thinking. sort of to save us all or something. Okay, sorry, I keep on going back and repeating the same point. Yeah, so anyway, it is okay, so I think that what we're feeling is that, you know, the sky is falling. The morality that we used to have, which was, you know, if I would just say roughly anchored in or framed by what I'll just call it British liberalism, that has uh, let's say culturally imploded in the general sense of the word. I mean, in the I mean, obviously there are a lot of people who still understand it and believe it, but now they don't have, let's say, the backing of the cultural hegemon. So we've kind of lost societal trust. We've lost public trust. And the only thing that we're allowed to trust now, is some kind of substitute other than humanism, or you know, that we're all in the same universal experience, we're all in the same universal thing, with our soul or whatever. Now that's been displaced by your category of lived experience or your identity. So you better cling to some kind of tribe or something like that. And you can't really consume media like that. It's almost dangerous to consume media like that, because, you know, you're watching media and it's like you're getting one message, but it's sending messages to other people. You know, it's trying to send out two messages at the one time. It's trying to work out, it's trying to send out a message of this weird kind of toxic encouragement to the sacred victim, you know, to some kind of underclass, and then it's trying to send out a threat to, you know, the white male privilege section or something like that. So it's got this pluralistic broadcast, you know, which is and this is why it's impossible to watch these shows that has this kind of writing built into it, because uh, it's denigrating, as I say. It's bigoted, it's prejudiced. You know, but that, you know, it also dismantles normative morality. But sorry, I was going to say as well that, you know, when you've got a non-normative morality, what you also have is you have a society which is very pliable, because you see, if virtue signaling is what happens, it is actively disrupting rules that operate across the board, and so you end up in the distortion of normative morality. You can hide some activity. You know, you can do you end up with a kind of a generally destabilized and corrupt culture that can facilitate, you know, sort of, you know, the general things that happen with oligarchies and plutocracies. Um, and I mean, some of them might even be well intentioned, because they actually believe in this secondary moral economy of virtue signaling, that somehow their virtue signal is actually efficacious in some way, but it ends up sort of being more and more radicalized. And I mean, I've got recordings that talk ad nauseum about how that moral economy is just fundamentally unstable and becomes a more and more radical sort of orthodoxy, because it's so unworkable. It's so sort of self-denigrating as well. Like it's because the blanket accusations that it makes against society also have to kind of be navigated by them themselves. And so the blanket accusation can only be escaped by being on the right side of a scapegoat or a witch hunt. And so you keep on having to invent a kind of an active ritualistic participation in being on the right side of the blanket accusation, because in some sense everyone doesn't escape it. You know, so there's an implicit hypocrisy which is roughly inescapable. and therefore the only way to kind of paper over that cognitive dissonance is to believe more radically in some kind of code of dicta, some list of rules that prove that if you follow those rules, that you're on the right side of the blanket accusation. And I mean, this is also, it's because you don't have a moral system. You just have a moral complaint. You have a definition of what is evil, of what is not, of what is unjust or injustice. And so because you've only got a negative value, the only way to prove that you have a moral system is if you can find someone to pin that accusation to. And so, and again, because essentially the whole matrix of that narrative is structured by a blanket accusation against the system, you always have to be part of bringing it down. So it becomes this kind of parasitic vampirism or whatever. And what's more than that is that, you kind of have to create a category that saves you from that. But it's always a fudged category, so it's this weird kind of, and so you have to try to fight against it being fudged. You have to say that no, we can be certain about this category, and that eventually sort of creates the Führer principle, which is the idea that you've created this relativism, you've created this moral relativism, but that you can also be objective about it. So you have to kind of look at this relativism from beyond the system. It has so many paradoxes and insanities a part of it. But anyway, I've got recordings that just deal with that. But so it's a this is a vortex. This is a doom spiral that just destroys itself horribly. I mean, I also talk about envy and jealousy, and anyway, I don't know. And the toxic self-esteem, essentially self-esteem in that system becomes hinged on belonging to a narrative and being able to project that narrative and project issues onto people from your subjective pedestal that you just kind of relativistically import under yourself for support whenever you need it. And so you never actually have to develop trust in anything other than the categories that make up your narrative. So your narrative becomes a kind of insulated solipsism as well. But I was going to talk about borderline personality disorder within this context, but anyway, I don't want to do that now. Anyway, so this is what I call sort of the cultural wasteland and the kind of what I would call a collapse. But the way through it, as far as I can see, is that there should actually be there should be a movement, there should be let's say a counterculture pushback that should not even care about necessarily taking back the culture. It should just care about getting its own house in order, which is that within some delineated space, it can have some kind of the old world back. It can have the normative morality back. That I think that there should be a constitution that distinguishes itself, at least from the wokeness, and it distinguishes itself based on, principles and real normative morality and a real division between these two ways of thinking. And then you could just say, well, actually, and people can say, they can point to the website or something. They can be like, oh, I'm part of that movement. I'm part of that movement. And so we know that we're both part of that movement. We know that we've both read that memorandum. And therefore, if we both say that we're both part of that movement, then we can trust each other, and uh, we can have friendship, and we can cultivate the things that we used to take for granted within our culture. That's what we need to do. We need to make it express. We need to make it patent, right? And it really needs to be a morality movement. It needs to almost be non-political in some sense. But I mean, it will be seen as political from the other side. And but then such a movement as well, businesses might be able to say, yeah, we are part of that movement. Therefore, these are our human resource practices. This is the culture of our company, is that movement, is like that movement. We need to have that. We need to have essentially a constitution of principles and values and morality that very clearly distinguishes itself from essentially the, what Thomas Sowell might describe as the unconstrained vision or whatever. But yeah, I think this is the panacea, as it were, and that under if we were able to do that, then we would also have used this whole tumultuous cultural war as an opportunity to do something real positive, which is that to know positively what separates us from essentially what I would just call as another form of vicious and parasitic nihilism. Um, but then then we'll actually come out of this with a cultural document. Um, I mean, just because we produce such a document won't, or which would also be an attestation at the end of it. But essentially, just um, just because we produce such a document doesn't mean that we will win the culture war. Maybe it's not even. I mean, we will perhaps be. It'll make winning possible, I think, at that point, because then we will actually be able to say, well, you believe that, and we believe this, and so now we actually have a fully articulated disagreement, whereas before it's just one-way accusations, and we are just constantly defending against those accusations instead of saying, no, 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 that's what I positively believe at. Address that and stop throwing accusations at me until you can address that. Otherwise, just leave me alone, and we can just shun them, essentially. And or it's not. It's just so that okay, well, before you have friends, oh well, are you a part of this movement? Do you believe in this movement? Oh, you haven't read it before. Well, how about you read it and you tell me if you are cool with that, so then I can know sort of where you stand on the spectrum, because right now, let's say the default position is somewhat like the woke. Uh, I mean, well, perhaps you can say it's the woke or the alt-right thing. Although I don't really see much ideological difference between either of them. They both have the same type of morality. Uh, they both categorize and conceptualize society in the same way. Uh, they just have a slightly different ordering in the priorities of their morality. Essentially, full-blown fascists believe in equality as a means to an end of proving, let's say, the purity of their chauvinism. Because if you don't start at an equal basis, you can't prove that your group is actually superior or stronger, or has some kind of proficiency or something like that. Whereas the SJWs, they believe that chauvinism is a means to achieving equality, which is, in some sense, I mean, Hitler would have just called them useful idiots, because that's obviously their whole sort of, they're there to destroy everything that doesn't sort of have a very clearly invested identitarian epistemological sort of ethnocentrism. It's so, it's like ethnocentrism is the answer to everything, and you have a false consciousness if you don't believe that Rainbow Hitler should come and impose a cultural totalitarianism to make people feel the right way about issues, to give the right amount of sympathy to one another and arbitrate between the different identities. You know, it's like creating all the infrastructure of fascism, but then it's supposedly to do it in order to achieve a quality of outcome, which, you know, already it can't. I mean, it's not possible to achieve. It's a stupid moral sort of imagination. You know, it's an attribute that you might give to someone in your imagination, but it doesn't even make sense to give people a quality of outcome, because it just, you know, which metrics will you choose? They'll always be arbitrary, um, because you're going to have to stop at some point, uh, unless you force everyone to have the exact same experience. The only way to do that is to kind of plug them all into a computer and give them the same simulated experience or something like that, you know, or make them surgically change them so that they're all identical to one another, you know, like where will you stop? Um, but already they are coming up with what the actual solution is that people, it's too painful for people to be around another, so you should actually preemptively segregate so that you don't represent to them, you know, the kind of something horrible about their lived experience or something like that. So people become so fragile, um, that they cannot tolerate the indignity of how they peg their identity in their own mind, and which becomes their only source of their self-esteem. So they can't ever generate authentic self-confidence, because all their self-esteem must be delivered to them through their identity. Um, and so essentially the control of the narrative again becomes all important, and it becomes a kind of ideological necessity. But yeah, so anyway, where was I going with this? And I mean, this is what happens when you don't have a clear understanding of things. And so essentially, you know, if we don't start, let's say, morally distinguishing ourselves from these sorts of, from what is almost, I would call it, sort of this pernicious nihilism, and we'll start seeing that it's actually hard for people to give up nihilism. Most people, even the people who are militantly against the SJWs, have other forms of nihilism. Their nihilism's all over the place because they are comfortable, because that means that you can just have an external locus of control. You can just sort of, you know, I mean, people do this in their blind belief of science. People do this, you know, in their kind of in their weird moral sort of bullshit. You know, I mean, I'll just give one example, which is vegetarianism or veganism that is based in some kind of moral sentiment. Now, I'm not criticizing people who believe in reincarnation and who have a whole belief system, because that's a more complicated sort of phenomena than what I'm talking about. But people who literally believe that animals have the same moral standing and value as human beings, or that human beings should treat them as if they do, even though that they don't have the same moral standing, but human beings should still treat them as if they do. What this actually ends up doing is it ends up devaluing uh, the moral standing of human beings, which is based on their sentience. Human beings are sentient. That means that they're capable of free will. Animals are not capable of free will. Uh, to be capable of free will, you have to make decisions. You have to be able to understand things. You have to have concepts in your mind to have free will. Now, not every human being has free will. They have the capability of having free will because they are sentient. Sentience is the capability to exercise free will. It doesn't mean that you do exercise free will, but it means that you can. And I don't want to get too much into the psychology of this, but this is because human beings have introverted feeling, so they can have an understanding of inner of they can create internal impressions of their feelings, and they can that's essentially what concepts are made out from, essentially. Now, you can have a whole you can mess up your concepts, or you can have a system of concepts which essentially don't amount to an understanding. They just amount to sort of nonsense or sophistry or something like that, or just um, but they still have sentience. Okay. uh, and we respect human beings for their capacity, because until they're dead, they can still uh, achieve. I mean, again, I would link this back to what I have vaguely referred to as British liberalism, which, as I've said, is almost like a spiritual. It's a very almost spiritual kind of culture, and we have. I think we have eventually divested from that, because essentially we have allowed nihilism to take root. Anyway, I'm not going to go too much down this tangent, but I think it is roughly a fact that the kind of moral nonsense that you get, which effectively says that, well, animals are morally equivalent to human beings, or should be treated as if they are, is to not understand, and is to literally devalue the distinction. And when you devalue the distinction, you essentially you make the discrimination between the categories opaque. Uh, you make it remote. You start to dissolve the actual, and I'm using discrimination in the sense of discernment, in the sense of think. You have to discriminate in order to delineate uh, between objects in the mind that you have named uh, and furnished with the attributes that amount to the particular delineations that then you can hold in contradistinction to one another. Um, and when you are going to say, well, yes, they have different attributes, but they should be treated the same, then in some sense you're saying, well, in principle, I'm not against discrimination or discerning, but it all amounts to the same effect anyway. So it's kind of becomes pointless to actually actively discriminate, because you should just adopt some kind of set belief that uh, that makes it unimportant to actually make the distinction or not. Um, and then, in some sense, you become sort of captive to your belief, rather than, um, let's say, a managerial cultivator of your beliefs, that you um, are fully responsible for holding. Um, Rather, uh, you have this idea that uh, the belief is above you, but in a way in which that you don't have to understand it. Actually, the metaphor works out better than is that the belief is below you and you are living upon it. That it's kind of like the floor, um, and you can't sort of escape from living on that perch or sort of on that pedestal. You can't, uh, and essentially everything that you do is upon it, is sort of leans on that support that is underneath you. And so I would say that it's a if you want to call it an understanding, it's a blind understanding or a dark understanding. Um, in that you're only responsible to it, and you're not responsible for holding it. So there's also got this kind of this weird sort of external locus of control. Anyway, so I'm roughly calling that nihilism, although it's probably slightly more complicated than what at least what some definitions of nihilism might be. But I think that, uh, roughly speaking, that's the kind. I think it's a fairly good approximation or generalization of what we are culturally, in the midst of being confronted by. And it's a hungry wolf, and if you feed it, it just sort of gets stronger, and it will pursue you further. um, and it will, it will, if it is left too long, it will eventually consume everything. I do believe that. um, and what should rather happen is that, we should at least work out how to fortify ourselves against it. We should not, we shouldn't have to kill it. We shouldn't have to. Um, in fact, I don't even mind if it continues. I'm happy to live in a minority. I really am. Uh, I think it would even be better, because then at least people that are on my side, if we are going to be able to construct a side, are going to know that they chose to be in a minority, and they chose to be on this side of the fence, as it were. But the important thing is that, we mustn't be fenced in. We need to fence the wolf out. We mustn't just be fenced in by the wolf as it's corralling us. So I do think that it's the onus is on us to erect the fence, uh, so that at least we can uh, hold some uh, place, and position, and also know what side of the fence people are on. So yeah, I think that is what is really required. Um, and in some sense, it should not be. It shouldn't. It. What I'm talking about is only a fence. It's not. the actual zest of life. It's not the activity inside of the fence. It just allows the activity inside of the fence to occur. You're not going to say, oh, do you believe in this movement? Okay, let's talk every day, and in our whole friendship, all we'll do is talk about how this movement is a political movement, or how it's politically contradistinctive to people who don't belong to the movement. It's just, oh yes, we're both part of the same movement. Okay, so we can go and have a drink. We can go and talk about philosophy. We can go play a game of something, and I don't have to worry that I'm going to uh, get me too'd or something. I mean, or whatever the latest panic is. That uh, it's just in some sense knowing that. I mean, it doesn't mean that even that you necessarily trust the person. It just means that you know that it might be possible to develop trust with that person. It doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot, but it's let's say it's a necessary condition. It's not a sufficient condition for anything. So I think it's important to get the necessary condition for having a healthy culture between and I say culture as in a conscious set standard of how you relate to other people that you know. That is a culture, but it will have to be a more conscious culture, in the sense that I think it needs to be memorandized. A constitution needs to be drawn up, not as a political thing, not as a legal thing, just as a cultural document. Um, anyway, uh, and then perhaps we'll start getting art and comedy back, because the comedian will be like, it's like you put a little emblem up or something like that, that maybe means that you are a part of the movement, or you know that director and those writers are on that side of the fence. So then you know that at least you're not going to be force fed, ideological, agenda driven garbage, and perhaps which journalists are not complete hacks and sort of activist journalists. Um, and then at least we can say, well, we know that you're not this, so we know that there's something defective about you if you can't even sign up to these apolitical principles. Like how the hell can you not sign up to these principles? How or they'll obviously have to come up with some kind of bullshit. They'll have to call the whole thing racist, or call the whole thing something or another. They'll have to invent some trumped up ideological bullshit. But then at least then we can be like, it doesn't matter, because we can say, well, we know what the document is, we've read it. So you have a blanket accusation against people who are so, well, good, I don't want to associate with you anyway. So it's good. I'll put it on my T-shirt, so then not to associate with me. It'll be wonderful, because then I don't have to go through the world trying to talk to people and knowing that they're idiots, because I can just wear something and the idiots will just be repelled from me automatically. I mean, and only the people that I want to talk to will won't be repelled from me. I mean, it'll be wonderful. So I mean, again, I see it as this is potentially a hugely positive thing, that at least we can very quickly know the undeveloped, immature, childish idolaters of an external locus of control, who believe in some kind of nihilistic creed that gives them this disgusting relativistic, sort of power over people to project things onto them. I mean, it's wonderful. Imagine how much easier finding a woman will be under such circumstances. You already, all the poisonous, toxic ones that never developed a real character, because their whole life they could just plug into this toxic narrative about being a victim, and being able to kind of scapegoat any and all of their own failings. And there was a plethora of beta males sort of egging them on in their "you go girl," sort of watching female Ghostbusters, sort of destroying all art and comedy because uh, girl power and hashtag down with the patriarchy. It's you know these are people that you don't, I mean, these are people that will only raise fascist children. They will raise children that will believe in superficial morality, that will believe in judging people based on their appearance, judging people based on their race and on their sex. I mean, these are people who are going to lead to so many bad things. Imagine if you can just say, my business has this culture, so and puts up that symbol, and then all the SJWs won't want to work for you. Like, just imagine that. Just imagine that. I mean, that you already have all the worst people in the world who will self-select themselves out of trying to become part of your company. I mean, just imagine all the headaches that will be completely avoided, and they can go be hypocritical somewhere else and create some toxic, sort of witch hunt and scapegoating and create, I mean, I shouldn't even include it here, but the level of sort of self-victimization that happens, and in terms of how they cultivate abuse in order to feed the narrative, because it's a ravenous narrative that needs to be propagated, because otherwise they don't know how to escape their own hypocrisy. This is why they have such terrible, what's the word, incidents and scandals. This is why all these, you know, people that profess that, they always have some drama that they are embroiled with. It's endemic to them. They're like magnets for it, because that's what their whole narrative. That's all they think about. That's all they meditate on. They just hope for one day that they can stand up to someone who is representing, you know, because no one gives them the opportunity to have that grandstanding moment. It's that's what their whole psychology is centered around. I mean, uh, it's such a waste of time. It's such a diversion. They can't even get anything done because everything has to conform to the moral narrative. They don't even know what's going on in front of them. And this is why they can never develop any self-confidence, because they can only extract it sort of parasitically. Um, and this is also why they're such awful people to be around. All this is all they can communicate about. It's almost like, essentially their whole social circles revolve essentially around gossip. Uh, it's hideous. These are not the vacuous people uh, that you can do anything stable with. I mean, it gets more and more disorientated. It gets more and more, the hyper-realism, the narrative gets more and more sort of frivolous and strange. And also their views on reality starts getting way more mythological. It there's a weird kind of magical occultism that they have about fate, about sort of elite. They have a weird kind of elitism. They really have such weirdly incoherent beliefs about things. And I should have gone more into the science stuff, because that also, there are huge parallels to draw between the kind of the moral nihilism, but also, let's say, the material nihilism and the factual, claims of so-called science, when science philosophically doesn't understand. Now I've said it, I should explain it, but now I'm just, this is a bit of a tangent, I guess, but Science doesn't know anything about time because it presumes things about time to philosophically get itself off the ground. Its methodology is based on predictability and falsification. Uh, so, how can it investigate time when science can only know things if you presume that time is the causative, uh, uh, that time is a generic causative determinant? Because, you know, if predictability is your test for falsification, then time itself has to be equidisposed to presenting the truth to you. You know, so I mean, it has all these weird beliefs in it that time is a fungible commodity, essentially, that it can be quantized, and that some section of time, some quantity of time, is causally indistinguishable from some other section of time. You know, so now these are things that are presumed about time just to have a scientific methodology. And then so essentially, I mean, you can have science, you really can. You can try to do what you want with science, but then you have to concede that science can tell you nothing about what time is, because you're already depending on it in a very particular way, and you've done so just based on a blind presumption. And now you want to call this empiricism. You can't do that. It's empiricism under the caveat that temporal determinism is true. You can say that. So under the presumption that temporal determinism is reality, is a mainstay feature of reality, then you can call it empiricism. But can it be empirical about time itself? No, it can't. You can empirically discover nothing with science about time, because you've already presumed too much. And this is why time, or this is why science completely breaks down when it actually discovers, and it frankly it has already debunked itself. Science has debunked itself, because we know that time is not deterministic. We know that the universe is probabilistic, and that it is not a deterministic universe. So what does that tell us? Well, it tells us we need to apply some better philosophy than just assuming that science is empirical, because it obviously isn't. You know, I would QED, it isn't at this point. Just put some common sense into it. But no, we've got too many people. I guess you can't call it virtue signaling. I would say it's epistemic signaling, or something like that. Epistemological signaling that science is the root of understanding reality, which is, you know, such a harebrained, fudged conceptualization. It's really disgusting, because science really used to have honest language. It used to say not that it was discovering laws of the universe, but that it was uncovering regularities. And so the caveat was already built into it, that this was not a law of reality. This was just something that seemed to be regular in reality, that we have discovered a regularity. A regular feature. And so it was already there to be philosophically, honestly interrogated at some point. But now we have disgusting terms like scientific axiom. Because we can't call it an axiom, because it isn't an axiom, but it's required for science. So we'll use the word axiom and call it a scientific axiom, and we'll believe that it's just as good as any other axiom, because that's how dishonest we are, because we can just bend language and just make up terms that are utterly embarrassing. Uh, and this is what clever people do now, and it's this it's exact. I'm almost glad that the SJWs are as wicked and as stupid as they are, because at least now I can explain to so-called science-minded people, scientism, how equivalently retarded they are. I mean that in the English sense of the word. It is a word. Uh, I mean, yeah, retarded is, I would say, a pretty good word to describe these things. Another, because I mean it in the vein of nihilism. I mean that they are, yeah. So I would link that that label there, retarded, with nihilism. That's kind of how it's slow on it's slowed to the point at which it can't even recognize its own sort of faithlessness. Uh, anyway, let me stop this recording. I think that's everything intelligent I have to say about this topic.